How it is even possible a 55-year-old train ticket and an atomic bomb could solve a cold case? Stay till the end of the video to find out. You don't want to miss this. Hi there, I'm Angie, and today we're counting down 5 cold cases that have been solved in unbelievable ways. Let's begin with number 5. NASA technology solves manslaughter cold case. When we think of NASA, what usually comes to mind is astronauts in space, the moon landing, or in my case, monkeys orbiting the Earth and throwing feces. However, as you would imagine, NASA has developed advanced technology that many times is useful not only in space. Specifically, one time it helped solve a cold case that troubled the police for years. First though, let's lay out the facts about the crime. In 1991, Dawn Sanchez went missing from her motel in Los Altos, California, where she was last seen riding away with her boyfriend, Bernardo Vaz, in a 1979 Pontiac Grand Prix. Although Bernardo was the presumed murderer, there was no evidence. No body, weapon, or even a sign of the distinct car could be found, so the charges were dropped. Some years passed by, and while Bernardo assured though that he got away with that, a tip came to the authorities. Some evidence about her murder was buried in a vacant lot in Alviso. However, excavating the entire area was impossible to do. Determined to find a workaround the district, attorney called for surveying help from United States Geological Survey, who connected the investigators with NASA's Payload Directed Flight Research Group. When Bernardo did the crime, little did he know that years later he was going to have his ass kicked by a group of nerds. You see, this particular group developed technologies to help Earth science missions gather data through magnetic and ground-penetrating radar sensors. In this case though, the mission took place on the large vacant lot in Alviso. Scientists and engineers took part in the project, mapping out the area's magnetic environment and marking areas of potential interest. Thanks to the NASA team's help, car parts that matches Bass's vehicle were unearthed in the Alviso lot, providing evidence that helped convict him of manslaughter. If dab was a thing back then, I can imagine a room filled with scientists dabbing when the first car parts were discovered. NASA really was an ace up the sleeve in that case, but let's move to the next one, where real playing cards were involved. Number 4. Playing cards solves a case. You heard it right. While a deck of cards solving a case sounds cool, losing all your money in poker doesn't. So please try to not use our next case as an excuse for gambling. Let's begin with the sad part. In 1979, Susan Swartz was shot and strangled in her home in Snohomish County, 15 miles north of Seattle. The case was an instant dead end. No one had a clue about a possible motive, and even less about the culprit. Lacking any clear-cut evidence, the investigators had to put the case aside. So icy cold it was for 32 freaking years. That was until 2 Snohomish County detectives, Jim Scorff and Dave Hageman, came up with a completely new way to solve cases. It was essentially a regular deck of cards, only with faces and data of missing people in the area that are current cold cases. As clever as that was, it was just the first step in their master plan. Step 2 involved taking these decks and handing them out to the prisons all over Washington state, in hopes that some bored con playing poker recognized the people on the cards. Step 3, if a prisoner tipped the detectives on the fates of these people, there would be a reward. With the right incentive, be it money, a will to correct past wrongs, or just snitching on a guy they hate, a prisoner can be perfectly willing to aid the police. This is what happened with the case of Susan Swartz. One convict recognized the victim's face on one of the cold case playing cards and alerted the authorities. These caused the police to reopen the case 3 decades after the crime, examine the evidence, and eventually convict a 57-year-old man from Seattle. getting arrested for a crime you did 30 years ago. Although we don't know what the exact tip the prisoner gave the authorities was, it's believed that the man, then just a boy, was an eyewitness to the crime, and the killer had threatened to kill him too, if he ever told anyone. After a hard-knock life and a prison sentence or 6, such threats were now a joke, so he had no problem spilling the beans once he learned the case was still open. So, the killer got owned, the kid took revenge, and we can happily move to number 3, teeth bite. I'm sure that you all have seen on shows like CSI that sometimes even the slightest mistake a killer makes can be used against them. That's exactly what happened to our next case, but let's start from the beginning. In the summer of 1978, the body of a young woman was found partially submerged in a large drum of water in the small town of Wood River, Illinois. Her name was Carla Brown, and she had been brutally beaten, raped, and murdered. Although the crime appeared to be rushed and poorly planned, there seemed to be no evidence pointing toward a suspect. After 2 years, investigators finally noticed a set of bite marks on Brown's shoulder. You might be wondering, how did evidence like that slip from the investigators for so long? I honestly don't know. But the thing is that even then, the breakthrough was useless without a set of teeth for comparison. Luckily, 2 years later, in 1982, the killer made a second mistake. A woman reported that she overheard a man named John Prante mention the bite on Brown's shoulder. And that was a huge one, because the police had only recently discovered this detail, and it was all but impossible for an innocent member of the public to know about it. Maybe John was drunk at the time, or simply stupid, but this piece of evidence was the beginning of his doom. Police exhumed Brown's body to create a mold of the skin where she had been beaten, and another mold was taken from Prante's mouth. As it was expected, they matched, and Prante was convicted of murder and sentenced to 55 years in prison. If you're blown away by this case, then you should see the next one. Number 2, atomic bomb. You see what I did there? Well, how can an atomic bomb solve a cold case? Usually nuclear bombs tend to be bad news for everyone, unless you happen to be a nuclear-themed superhero. However, in some particular cases, nuclear testing have its benefits. One being a missing child case that was finally solved after 41 years thanks to the weird after effects of all those nuclear explosions. See, back in the Cold War era, America did a bunch of above-ground nuclear testing to brace for the eventual hell that seemed destined to break loose between them and the Soviets. A byproduct of these tests was carbon-14, an isotope that spread all across the globe. It turns out the radioactive isotope that the mad scientists of 1950 were pooping all over the world did leave an imprint on people's teeth. The dental enamel of everyone who lived through or were born during the Cold War carries traces of carbon-14, making their mouths a tiny bit radioactive. Unfortunately, it doesn't make them glow in the dark, but there's an even cooler use of it. Radiocarbon is an effective tool in determining the time of death and age of victims in forensic cases where teeth are available. Literally, all the scientists need to do is compare the carbon-14 records to how much of the stuff the victim has on their teeth, and they can determine a birth date within a few years. Let's be honest, if you ever saw that on CSI, you'd call bullshit and change to a more realistic crime-fighting show like Scooby-Doo. To cut to the chase, they found out that they could use this method to all these bones that the local law enforcement have found over the period of time. In one case, the police had been struggling for years to identify John Doe, whose skull had been found in a river in 1968. All they knew was that it was belonged to a kid. With that technique, they were able to place his birth year between 1958 and 1962, which combined with other CSI techniques allowed them to finally identify the remains of the missing child, 41 years after the initial discovery. If you think 41 years sounds like a big period of time, then you would be amazed by our final cold case. Number 1. Super old train ticket solves a case. Does anyone else have the habit of keeping tickets for a long period of time? I know I do, but it doesn't matter because I don't intend to kill anybody, at least for now. Let's just say that if you plan to do a crime, you might want to consider dropping this habit. I'll explain why. In 1957, second grader Maria Rudolph was kidnapped from her yard and murdered. Her body found months later 120 miles from home. Despite a massive national manhunt that involved everyone up to and including J. Edgar Hoover and President Eisenhower, the killer got away with it. No one was convicted and the case went unsolved. Now, let's fast forward to 2008. Huge time jump, I know. On her deathbed, an old Illinois woman grabbed her youngest daughter's hand and uttered the words, "John did it, and you have to tell someone." Sounds a little bit cliché, but fortunately, the daughter knew what she was talking about and alerted the authorities. There was only one problem. John, also known as John Tessier McCullough, the old woman's son, was a model citizen with an airtight alibi. He had been in another town during the abduction, enlisting in the Air Force and undergoing their physical. He had since become a decorated Air Force and Army veteran who had risen to the rank of captain and was awarded a Bronze Star for his service in Vietnam. He had even been working as a police officer at one point. Serve and protect, right? If you want to serve and protect anyone, then put a bullet to your head, Johnny. Anyway, still, luckily a dying mother's accusing finger was enough to raise a few eyebrows. The cops started circling around McCullough, but quickly found that they could not break his alibi, which had been backed by his family and had held up for more than 5 damn decades. Yet, the police persisted and re-interviewed a bunch of people connected with the suspect. One routine interview with a former girlfriend led to her giving the investigators an old photograph from their time together. When the photograph was inspected, something fell out from the back. A train ticket from the time of the kidnapping. A government-issued train ticket of the sort they give out when you're about to enlist in the Air Force and take the physical in another town. But it was unused. In other words, he had never taken the trip he claimed in his alibi. The police immediately named him a suspect and put him in a photo lineup where an eyewitness who was playing with Maria on the night of her abduction easily identified McCullough as the kidnapper. Get schooled, Johnny! It's not unusual for an ex trying to harm you in every possible way, but that one was an unintentional one. Because of the crime's peculiar nature, the 73-year-old McCullough was charged under the laws of 1957 and sentenced to serve the rest of his natural life in prison. The case remains the oldest solved cold case in history and serves as a reminder to all criminals out there that you can never know if you got away with it, even if decades have passed. If you find yourself fascinated with that old train ticket, then you should watch my Scary Things Found Under Ice video or the Scary Time Capsules from the past. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.